All right, Galatians 3:11. Now it is evident that no one is justified before God by the law, for, quote, the righteous shall live by faith, end quote. All right, let's start exegeting. Comments. This verse is made up of two clauses, in case you weren't following along. We have a thesis, which is no one is justified before God by the law. And then we have this proof text from the Habakkuk verse there, the proof text, the righteous shall live by faith. And it's joined by the conjunction for, which introduces the proof text, right? No one is justified by God by the law, for. In other words, according to Paul's understanding in his mind, when he goes back and reads the passage out of the Tanakh, out of the Old Testament, it forms for him the proof of what he's trying to teach his detractors, of what he's trying to get across, not only to his readers there in the region of Galatia, but more specifically also to the influencers, or the what people call the Judaizers. So, the first clause, of course, is Paul's thesis, his argument, his statement about his theological position that he's trying to put forth about how that no one is justified before God by the law. Let's talk about that first clause. This first clause itself actually comes on the immediate heels of Galatians 3:10, right? Which, if I go back over to the ESV version, 3:10, if you remember, reads, "For all who rely on works of the law are under a curse, for it is written," then he quotes that passage out of the book of Deuteronomy that we read. And then he says, "Now it is evident that no one is justified by God before the law." So let's talk about this phrase, "Now it is evident that no one is justified by God before the law." In my commentary, I state that this phrase, "no one is justified by God before the law," right? This is a very emphatic statement from Paul. It's a statement that, by historical context, must very likely mean, quote, "no one is justified before God by works of the law, viz., by Jewish identity and maintenance of Torah, or by submission to a man-made ceremony as postulated by the prevailing halakha of the first century Judaism's," end quote. Now, for those of you who are following along with me, you're thinking, Ariel, that is quite the lengthy paraphrase of Paul's statement. Where are you getting the impetus to say that you think that's what it likely means? Well, let's just work on it. I think you're going to see it in my way as well. Let's quote James D.G. Dunn. He's a favorite of mine. Dunn's comments on this particular verse, I think, are appropriate. Let's read Dunn. He writes, quote, that en namo, which is the Greek by the law of verse 11, that this phrase is equivalent to ex ergo namu, which is works of the law from verse 10, right? That that these two phrases are equivalent, one being by the law and the other by works of law, that or in works of the law, by works of the law, the Greek preposition in by the law, and the Greek preposition ex in as in of the or out of the works of the law. Dunn says that this understanding that they're both the same is plain, and he cites Bruce's commentary from Galatians on page 161. But Dunn says that this is made plain because there's a parallel, as also the parallel between 3:11 and 2:16 confirms. Basically, Paul must be using some sort of shorthand when he says no one is justified by God by the law, because he really just means by works of law. So we have this insight into works of law and by the law, in Paul's mind, must refer to similar things, or at least very closely related things, if they are not exactly the same thing, because he uses the phrase justified. And in the phrase justified, it's the same Greek word in both cases. All right, let's keep reading Dunn. In Jewish self-understanding, to be en namo, to be by the law, is to live ek pistios, by faithfulness. And in both cases, Dunn goes on to say, the man who is righteous before God being in view, his righteousness being defined and documented precisely by these two phrases, en namo, which is by the law, and ekpistios, which is by faith. Remember, this is the Jewish self-understanding of the first century that we're primarily focusing on right now. The Jewish person living in Paul's day believed that he was by the law and that he was of righteousness, or by righteousness, within faithfulness, And because of his living by the law and by faithfulness, these two features of his life cause him to be righteous, dikaiosune, or something to that effect in the Greek. What is done, go on to conclude, he says, to do what the law specifies for the covenant people is to live en autois, by them, to live by them. To live ekpistios, by faithfulness, is also the same thing. So there's this whole concept in the Jewish self-understanding of the first century that to live by the law is to live by faithfulness, is to be counted as righteous, and is to actually live by them. So all of these phrases kind of fit together for the Jewish self-understanding, the person who lived in the first century. In namo, ekpistios, in autois, which is to be justified. All right. By the way, Dunn's quote was lifted from Jesus, Paul, and the Law, the book that I have sitting on my desk right here, 1990, page 228, with a footnote from 235.